Welcome to the Just Ingredients podcast. I'm Cara Lynn, and here we talk all things nourishing to the mind, body, and soul. This is a place where you can find just good ingredients to life. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, I'm really excited to have Dr. James D. Nicolantonio on the show with us today, a doctor of pharmacy and cardiovascular research scientist. He's a leading expert in health and nutrition, has authored over 250 medical publications, and written 10 best-selling books, including The Salt Fix and The Mineral Fix. Many of you know him from Instagram, and I'm excited to answer many of your common questions today with him. So welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Carolyn.
Well, will you tell my listeners if they don't know who you are, which I don't know how they couldn't know who you are. You're amazing on Instagram and just teaching so many amazing things. But maybe just give them a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, so I graduated from the University of Buffalo with my doctor of pharmacy about 15 years ago. And my background really started with publishing on medications, and I was seeing actual patients at the time. So I was a clinical pharmacist, also a specialty pharmacist. And at a certain point, medications only did so much for my patients. So I started to learn about nutrition, nutraceuticals, etc. And also a lot of my patients were coming in not feeling good on the low salt diets that their doctor had put them on. And so that also drove me to kind of research more about salt and put out that book. And I then got a position at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute as a cardiovascular research scientist. And my sole duty was to basically just dig into the literature and publish. And so that's what I did for 10 years. And through that knowledge, I also wrote a bunch of health books. So that's sort of a quick background elevator pitch, I guess, on who I am.
Yeah, you are very educated, very knowledgeable. I love all that you're teaching on Instagram. And so I love that you talk about all different topics on Instagram. One day you're talking about collagen, and one day magnesium, and one day salt. And so we're just going to cover some of the topics that you talk about that I get a lot of questions from my followers on. And so I have a lot of women followers, and one topic that I get a lot about, or a lot of questions on, is sugar cravings, all about sugar cravings. And so I have so many questions on these. So let's maybe just start with, are sugar cravings linked to a nutritional deficiency, hormonal imbalances, a gut dysbiosis, lots of things? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think the two most common causes of sugar cravings is, number one, you actually do need some carbohydrates, your glycogen depleted, or number two is that you are deficient in salt. And so the two taste receptors that we have, salt and sugar, basically they give you a reward response in the brain when you consume them. But when you don't get enough salt, because it's an essential mineral, there has to be some mechanism to tell let's say, the animal to go and seek out salt when it's deficient. And that mechanism is an activation of the dopamine reward center in the brain to drive the animal to seek out salt and to consume it. And then you get a hyper reward from it when you're deficient to make sure that the animal consumes enough of it. So unfortunately, though, that can sort of increase the sugar craving response because you are hyperactivating the dopamine reward center when you're not getting enough salt. So by simply making sure that you're getting enough salt every day, that will definitely decrease the amount of sugar cravings. And this has been shown in many animal studies. It's been proven if you deplete an animal of salts, it will increase their reward response for sugar and for also addictive substances of abuse like cocaine and Adderall.
Interesting. So how does someone know how much salt is good enough?
It's going to be different for everyone because everybody lifestyle is different. So if you consume a lot of coffee or caffeine, you're going to need more salt. If you sweat a lot, you're going to need more salt. Those are the two main drivers of, I would say, from a lifestyle perspective on who's going to need more salt. So if you consume 1 cup of coffee, you need an extra 400 milligrams of sodium. If you exercise for 1 hour per day, you're typically on average going to need about 1,000 milligrams more of sodium than a normal person. But on average, you're looking at somewhere between 1.5 to 2 teaspoons of salt for most people seems to be an optimal intake.
Per day.
Per day. Yep.
Okay. So could these sugar cravings, though, be due to a nutritional deficiency other than salt, like maybe magnesium?
Well, I think there's several minerals that are important for metabolizing glucose in the body. And so that one would be magnesium, one would be copper, chromium. I think what helps a lot of people too, and even myself with sugar cravings, is you just need a sweet taste to kind of curb the craving too. So inositol is actually a great powder that I'll put on my towel. I'll take like 2 or 3 grams of that, and that will cut a sugar craving. But combining sour, for some reason when you have salt plus sour, you're hitting those two sort of taste receptors at the same time. So if you have like a lemon lime electrolyte, that seems to really help with sugar cravings, or grapefruit, or anything that's sour plus salt will really help with sugar craving, even pickle juice.
That's interesting. Just because it's a like a salt with a sour, 2 different receptors that it's hitting, is that why?
Yeah, you're getting that dopamine response in the brain, and you're sort of calming down the reward center that is hyperactivated, sort of giving you those sugar cravings.
Okay, so still with sugar cravings, do you think sleep and stress both affect sugar cravings?
I think, from me personally, I can say that if I have a stressful day, I definitely have more cravings for food overall. And we do know that stress drives overall food intake, and also so does lack of sleep. So it's been shown that if you are sleep deprived, let's say you only get like 5 hours of sleep at night, the studies have shown you'll consume anywhere from 200 to 450 calories more the next day. So definitely sleep actually has a role in how much actually food we consume.
Okay, so it might just be that someone's not getting enough sleep, it might be that somebody is too stressed, or it might be they're not getting enough salt, or there might not be getting enough magnesium or copper. It could be a whole slew of issues, correct?
Hmm. I think so.
Would you say that gut dysbiosis plays a role or not necessarily?
Well, I would say when I think of gut dysbiosis, or basically let's call it intestinal like permeability, like damage to the
Okay.
gut, people just call it leaky gut. I view that as mostly causing a lot of inflammation in activation of the microglia in the brain, which will release things like tumor necrosis factor and damage leptin signaling. So actually a lot of obesity and overeating is driven by the endotoxin that leaks into the body that activates inflammation, damages the leptin signaling in the brain, and now you're overeating because you've damaged that's kind of satiety center. So when I think of that kind of stuff, that's how I kind of think of it.
Oh, that's interesting. So, all of the foods that are contributing to leaky gut could play a role in your sugar cravings because of that leptin being ruined.
Yeah, yeah, like exactly, kind of blunting the leptin signaling, causing you to overeat or overconsume even sugar.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, so but for me, I feel like, I don't have sugar cravings as much if I keep my blood glucose levels more balanced throughout the day, meaning, like, eating always a carb with a protein or a fat. So, is that really a good way to manage sugar cravings?
Yeah, I'm making sure to consume like your protein and fat before carbohydrates, and that way you're decreasing the hypoglycemic effects, and also decreasing the consumption of processed grains. So like true unprocessed whole grains will have typically not a hypoglycemic effect, but most 99% of the grains in the United States are highly refined, even though they're considered whole grains. They'll still potentially drop your blood sugar too low. So it is always important to try to pair or consume protein, fat, and let's call them vegetables, fiber, however you want to talk about that, prior to consuming your more refined carbohydrates.
Okay, so, of course, cutting down sugar could help with cravings, but are there other dietary changes that you help or think that will help with these cravings? Is it mainly the salt, keeping the blood glucose levels down,
All of that,
lowering that inflammation?
yeah, all that we talked about, but also having like a high protein, moderately high fat breakfast will kind of keep you full and decrease those cravings throughout the day too. So kind of making sure you're fueling yourself right in the morning with healthy fats, healthy protein, I think is important too.
Okay, I'm curious, do you feel like intermittent fasting has a role in any of this or no?
So maybe I think if you, I used to be more of a fan of intermittent fasting. I'm less of a fan because I actually prefer to exercise more and fuel myself versus sort of like seeing how long I can go without eating. So if you're someone that's like less active, I think intermittent fasting makes a lot of sense. But if you're someone who wants to be more active, which is what I'm trying to do now, more play more basketball, lift more weights, etc., I think actually just feeding yourself 3 or 4 times a day with healthy meals is kind of like what my approach is now.
Okay, that makes sense. For me personally, if I do intermittent fasting and exercise, like lift weights in the morning and stuff, I find that my blood sugar drops too low too early in the day. And then when my blood sugar drops, that's when I want the sugar.
Mhm.
So I don't know if
Yes,
that's common for other people as well.
I think that's very common. Mhm.
Okay, so moving on to the next topic. I know that you talk about creatine quite often on your account. And so, why do you think people should supplement with creatine?
Well, I think basically the problem is that we need we're not able to synthesize enough. There's at least like 1 gram that we need to be consuming from the diet just to kind of remain in balance. So that's not talking about like any of the benefits that you even get by consuming like 3 to 5. But like if you're not getting at least 1 gram from the diet, you're gonna like slowly decrease the amount of creatine stores in your body because we simply just don't make enough. So that's kind of like not a lot of nutrients are like that where you have to where your body like isn't producing enough of it. So I would almost call it like an essential nutrient from that perspective. Like we don't get enough of it, so to speak. And then from a perspective of like, can you get enough of it through the diet? You can, but I think for optimal health, like optimal muscle, like basically what the studies are starting to show now is that we used to think maybe 5 grams was top, like maximum benefit. But now we're starting to see like zero point 0.1 grams per kilogram of body weight, especially if you have
Oh,
a high
wow.
lean body mass. So that for like a 70-kilogram person, that'd be like 7 grams of creatine
Mhm.
for optimal benefits. So I think from that perspective, we just don't get enough through the diet because you have to consume about mm, like 2.5 pounds of meat to get 5 grams of creatine, and it still has to have some of the pink.
Wow.
If you overcook your meat, it will degrade the creatine. So, like, if you eat just like a well done steak, you're not going to get much creatine. It has to have some pink in it to get like more of the creatine.
And is meat the best source of
Yeah,
creatine in our diet?
yeah, red meat is definitely the best source.
And let's back up a little bit for those that maybe don't know much about creatine. What actually is creatine?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, it's made up of different amino acids, one of them being glycine, which typically we don't get enough of that in the diet. So, partly we need glycine to basically create creatine, um, and we don't even get enough of that. And so creatine basically it helps recycle ATP. So basically helps put like phosphate groups onto ADP to form ATP. So during like really explosive exercise, creatine is sort of helping give you that ATP that the body needs to perform well. But also we have creatine stores in the brain too. So it takes about 4 weeks to kind of fully saturate your creatine stores, and then if you stop it, it'll wash out after 4 weeks. So it's kind of one of those things that if you don't keep taking, you'll lose the benefit. Um,
Hmm.
in that you don't have to do a huge load. Like a lot of people will say you have to take like 20 grams for like 5 or 7 days. You can just take like 5 to 7 every day. And then after 4 weeks, it's just a quicker way to boost your creatine stores if you do it at like 20 grams a day. But that can cause like bloating and upsets the stomach. So I typically like to just do more moderate intakes over the 4 weeks.
And after 4 weeks, do you stop for a week or you just take this every day for the rest of your life?
Yeah, it's the studies have always shown taking it on a consistent daily basis. And because if you stop it, it'll fully wash out of your skeletal muscle after about 4 weeks. And the way to optimize creatine too is there's been at least 2 studies comparing post-exercise creatine to pre-exercise, and the post-exercise has shown better improvements in strength, better lean mass gain, etc. And it's because exercised muscle takes up creatine better. And
Mm.
then when you add in carbs and protein too with the creatine, the insulin spike will help drive the creatine into the muscle better as well. So ideally, take creatine post-exercise with carbs, with protein, and then on non-exercise days, just try to take it when you consume like carbs and protein.
Oh, that's actually really interesting. That's good to know.
Mhm.
Okay, so for years and years, creatine was just known for the gym bros to get, to gain a lot of muscle. And so now women are trying to figure out like, oh, should I take this? Should I not? And I'm trying to teach that there's a lot of there's more benefits than just muscle building. Like you said, we have creatine stores in our brain. And so what are some of these other benefits of creatine?
Studies have looked at individuals like on mood, depression, especially in women, and creatine has been shown to have pretty significant effects. And partly you're fueling your brain cells with energy too. So that's kind of helping your overall brain activity, which can help with your mood, your focus, etc. So from a mental health perspective, it might be one of the best supplements, especially we're finding out for women.
Interesting.
Mhm.
You do not hear that in the mental health space. They're never talking about creatine.
No, they're just talking about like SSRIs and like your chemical imbalance. So
Yeah.
we like to focus more on natural substances.
Well, and also because creatine's helping with that ATP, I mean, it can help women's energy as well, right? People's energy. So they don't need to be a gym bro to be taking creatine.
Exactly. Yeah, it's gonna ATP is the cellular currency. Basically, all our cells use it to function. So it's gonna help everything out. You don't have to be an athlete to take it.
Well, and I'm thinking as you're saying we have creatine stores in our brain, then isn't this really beneficial for elderly and aging people?
Yeah, especially too if they and typically this is what happens when you get older, your appetite goes down. So you typically don't end up eating in your digestion. It's called achlorhydria. You don't produce as much stomach acid. So a lot of elderly find it difficult to digest meat. So they typically, the amount of meat people eat seems to decrease as they age. And so, of course, that's going to decrease the creatine they're intaking. So elderly probably would get the most benefit, especially if they're not consuming a lot of red meat.
Interesting. Okay, so there's a lot of creatines on the market. Do you like a specific type of creatine, or should there be a certain amino acid or mineral added to the creatine as well to help with absorption, or what are your thoughts?
Monohydrate is the most clinically studied. Some people do find that they digest the HCl better. Um, So it's just more pricey. I think it's like 3 times the cost as monohydrate. So I always just kinda recommend if you are getting a little bit of, like, gastrointestinal upset from creatine, just to kinda back off the dose in regards to acutely. So instead of taking, like, 5 or 10 grams at once, maybe only taking 1 or 2 and space that out over 2 or 3 times during the day.
All right, we're going to move on to the next topic, collagen. I know that you are an advocate for this as well. You have one post that I really like that says something about like if your knees are hurting, it's not a knee issue, it's a collagen issue, something like that. And so, um, why do you think people should supplement with collagen?
Well, it's the most abundant protein in the human body. It makes up 30% of all our protein. And it's 40% of bone. So half of our bone is protein, and 80% of that is actually collagen. And 70% of the protein in skin is collagen. So, and 25% of the dry weight of tendons and ligaments are collagen. So, it's a very, let's say, abundant protein, and we're not getting enough in the diet. So the studies have shown that if you take collagen, it improves, skin hydration, elasticity, reduces wrinkles. So it's really good for skin health, improves hair and nail health, improves like tendinopathies, um, improves blood pressure by improving arterial stiffness because your arteries are made up of collagen, improves gut health because your gut lining is made up of collagen. Like every organ is made up of collagen. Like the list goes on and on. I hate to kind of say like this supplement covers everything, but because it makes up literally everything, it's the glue that holds you together. And we're not getting enough because we don't eat nose to tail and we're typically not consuming a lot of collagen. Taking collagen supplements just has so much evidence for improving many outcomes.
Yeah, hundreds of years ago, they were eating nose to tail, and so they were getting that collagen, those collagen sources. But I hear a lot of people on social media say things like, "Oh, you shouldn't supplement with collagen because your body can't even absorb it." So, not correct?
Not correct. Yeah, that's a common misconception. So there's a few things. What they're thinking of is that well, your body's just going to break down the collagen into just amino acids, so I can just take amino acids. Well, yes and no. Yes, it does do some of that, but we actually do absorb many of those collagen peptides and tripeptides intact which actually can then stimulate our body's own collagen production. So their fault. It's wrong to think that because we're still absorbing the actual di and tripeptides. So it's not just amino acids that it's breaking down to. So that's one. Two is the amino acid profile of collagen is completely different than the amino acid profile of just regular protein. It's much higher in hydroxyproline and proline and in glycine. So those amino acids we don't typically get from the diet. So by getting and taking collagen, you're getting the main amino acids that build collagen that you're not getting from just a regular protein. So glycine makes up like 1 out of every 3 amino acids in collagen. Hydroxyproline is something like 20% of those. So by taking collagen, you're not only getting the di and tripeptides, but you're also getting the amino acids that like glycine, hydroxyproline, et cetera, proline, that you wouldn't be getting from just regular protein.
Okay, so is there a maximum allowable amount that we can take of collagen per day, or does it not
Yeah.
really matter?
Um, I don't think we know that yet. What I like to do is I try to do like 10 grams 2 or 3 times a day. So a lot of people do worry about like oxalates because it does increase urinary oxalates, but it doesn't seem to be clinically significant at 10 grams or less. I mean, I've taken 20, 30 grams in one sitting many, many times. I've never had an issue. I think if someone is prone to oxalate kidney stones, just keep the dose at 10 grams and not go above that just in case.
Okay, that's good to know because I only do about 10 grams a day. So I'm glad to know I can boost that to 20 or 30. So that's really good to know. Okay, the other thing though that gets confusing, because I know followers will DM in about this all the time. They're like, oh my gosh, there's all these different types of collagen. Like, how do I know if I take type 1 or 3 or what's the difference or does it really matter?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so most collagens are going to be bovine hide, which is mostly type 1, and I'll have a little bit of type 3. Type 2 is more for cartilage health. And so those three collagens make up like 95% of all the collagen in the body. With the other 20, there's total of 29 collagens, so minus 3. So the other 26 make up maybe 5 or 10%. So they're kind of
Mm,
inconsequential. So as long as you're getting 1, 2, and 3, you don't really hear much about the other ones because they're so inconsequential in regards to total amounts in the body.
okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
And so back to our exercising post that I was talking about. So when people's knees hurt at the gym, is that truly a sign of like, yeah, you might be lacking in collagen?
Well, 100% it could be. And frankly, from myself, like I had to stop running until I started taking collagen again. So my knees hurt so bad from running that I really couldn't run anymore. And then after like 8 weeks of taking collagen consistently, my knees were completely fine because you need to be consuming collagen to synthesize optimal amounts. Like a lot of people will say, oh, you just need like vitamin C to like make collagen, but you still need the building blocks. You still need the peptides, the amino acids to actually make it. And we don't really get enough of it in the diet unless you're taking collagen supplements. So yes, vitamin C is required to stimulate the messenger RNA in the cells that produce collagen, chondrocytes in cartilage. There's cells in skin that make collagen, etc. But if you don't have the building blocks to do it, it's not going to be helpful.
Okay. And so there are a lot of bone broth proteins out there. So is that a good source of collagen or they need to do collagen separately?
Most of the time, a typical bone broth protein is not high in collagen. Um, and most bone broths are not high in collagen unless you're using collagenous meats to make it. And the only way to find out is to throw that stock in the fridge overnight. And then if there's a ton of gelatin, that's cooked and solidified collagen. So if you want to know if your bone broth has collagen in it, you put the liquid in the refrigerator, and if it forms a lot of gelatin, then it's good. It has a lot of collagen. But if it's only a little bit at the top, which a lot of them are, I've done this many times, then you're not getting much collagen at all.
That's really good to know because some people market it as, get all your collagen for the day by drinking this bone broth protein, things like that. So that's good to know. And it makes sense because if you make your own bone broth, you'll see how it gets that layer, a big layer usually of the, yeah, of the gel at the top. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next topic, magnesium. I feel like this is sort of a hot topic right now on social media. A lot of people talking about, which is good, I think. But let's just explain a little bit about what magnesium's role is in the body.
Oh man. So let's say
800
what?
like different functions, huh?
Yeah. Yes. The most recent review paper showed that magnesium is required for at least 800 enzymatic reactions because it's a cofactor for enzymes to work. So for you to activate ATP, magnesium has to bind to it, cleave off the terminal phosphate, and that's what actually releases energy. So ATP doesn't work without magnesium. So nothing works without magnesium because everything runs on ATP. It's needed to make DNA, RNA, and proteins. So if you want to make collagen, you want to build muscle, you need to have magnesium, or otherwise you can't make protein. Um, in order to activate vitamin D, the enzymes in the kidneys and the liver, the hydroxylases, require magnesium as a cofactor. So you can't even activate vitamin D, which is what you need to absorb calcium. So bone health, magnesium helps to keep calcium out of the arteries, helps puts it into the bones, similar to K2, vitamin K2. So it's like nature's kind of calcium channel blocker is what we call it. It helps to dilate the arteries too by making sure calcium doesn't become overloaded, because when the smooth muscle gets overloaded with calcium, it will constrict. So it's good for blood pressure from that perspective. Blood sugar too, in order for insulin receptor, insulin functioning, GLUT4 transmitters and vesicles to come to the surface of the cell to take up sugar requires magnesium. Um, I mean, I don't wanna, like but you can see, you could just keep going on and on and on, like, what
Yeah,
magnesium.
it's very important. But the problem is a lot of people, a lot of Americans are deficient in magnesium. And
Okay.
so, well, let's start there. I have lots of questions. But why are people so deficient in magnesium?
Number 1, they're eating a lot of processed foods, and the processing of foods depletes magnesium. So you lose, like, almost 100% of magnesium from, when you consume, like, refined table sugar versus, like, molasses. Refined grains lose 80 to 90% of the magnesium. So just processing foods is in 60% of Americans' food is highly processed. Also, how we grow our food is different. We grow for high yield now. So basically, the crops don't have enough time to take up magnesium. So compared to 50 to 80 years ago, we have really good data on this. The magnesium content in crops has gone down by about 30 to 40%, and in animal foods, about 15 to 20%, because the crops they're eating are deficient in magnesium. And also, the phosphorus fertilizers that we're spraying on the crop dramatically decreases the amount of magnesium in the actual crop itself by up to 35-40%. So how we grow our food, the bad processed foods that we're eating, and then being sick, like regarding elevated blood sugar and insulin kicks magnesium out in the urine. You actually need good insulin sensitivity to drive magnesium into the cell, which a lot of people don't have. So they're cellularly deficient in magnesium. So all these things just are adding on top of the low intake, are causing you to become depleted at it.
Wow. I was just reading something the other day that 88% of Americans are dealing with insulin resistance. So if that's the case, then magnesium is an issue for that same group, right?
I would say so. And of course, there's varying degrees of it, and
True.
how much that's affecting the cell getting it. But to some degree, it has to be affecting how much the cell is taking up the magnesium. Um, but I mean, we know from good data from type 2 diabetic studies that at least 50% of type 2 diabetics are deficient in magnesium, upwards of 70%.
Okay, so you're talking about sickness and stuff causing issues with magnesium, but doesn't stress also sort of deplete magnesium?
Yeah, from a mechanistic perspective, when you're stressed, you have an increase in the sympathetic nervous system, things like adrenaline and noradrenaline. And what they do is they release magnesium from the cell. So the stress response through our adrenergic activity causes loss of magnesium out of the cell, and then we simply lose it in the urine when that happens. So there is a vicious cycle of stress and the catecholamines releasing magnesium, um, depleting magnesium even further and making the whole cycle worse.
Okay, well, as you're talking about this, I'm like, okay, most Americans are too stressed. They're eating ultra processed foods and our soil isn't what it used to be. So I'm like, well, it sounds like every single person should be supplementing with magnesium.
Yeah, I would say the only like group of people that needs to just be cautious is people who have pretty significant kidney dysfunction because that's the organ that helps us eliminate any excess magnesium. But for the most part, it's something that if almost everyone would probably benefit by taking at least 100 to 200 milligrams of elemental magnesium because most people are only consuming about 200 and most people need about 400 per day milligrams.
And so is this a concern for kids as well?
I think that yes, probably almost every single child is not getting optimal intakes of magnesium. It's just that deficiency of magnesium is like a slow, insidious process where, like, if you're deficient in it as a child, it's not like it's life threatening. But like when you're older, it becomes much more life threatening where you can have like a coronary artery spasm and literally cause you to die from like sudden cardiac death. Um, but yeah, I mean, definitely kids would probably benefit from having some extra magnesium as a supplement.
Okay, and I know from my followers that magnesium is confusing for them to buy at the store because they'll, go to Target and Walmart, wherever, and the cheapest form is magnesium oxide. And so they're writing in, like, should I be taking this one? And I'm like, there's a better choice out there. So, what, how do you help people through all that confusion of which form to take?
Yeah, so oxide requires like good amounts of stomach acid to absorb it. The one benefit of oxide is it's very high in elemental magnesium, but the downside is that the bioavailability, if you don't produce good stomach acid, is pretty low. So consuming a good bioavailable form like glycinate, malate, even citrate at lower doses does have good bioavailability. Actually, probably the most studied, oddly enough, is citrate because it's a cheaper form. But yeah, like those amino acid chelated ones, specifically glycinate, they're absorbed very well.
Okay, good to know. That is usually what I tell people. So glad we're on the same page. Let's take a quick break to hear from our show sponsor. It is important to make sure you're getting quality ingredients that are good for your body, inside and out. Some personal lubricants contain ingredients like parabens, glycerin, or petrochemicals, which have been linked to hormone disruption. Coconu's organic and natural lubricants are thoughtfully made with high quality, safe ingredients such as organic coconut oil, coconut water, beeswax, and cocoa butter. They are cruelty free, made in the USA, and their packaging is plastic free. To Coconu, details matter. For an exclusive discount code, head to coconu.com. That is coconut without the T. And use code Carolyn15 for 15% off your order. My code stacks with their on-site discount, so trust me and try it today. Now back to the show. Okay, we're gonna move on to salt because it is a hot topic, I feel like. But the confusion, I think, well, the concern people have is sodium with high blood pressure. So, how does sodium play a role in this? Should people be as concerned as they are? What are your thoughts on sodium and blood pressure?
So if our population was healthy, I would say maybe only 1% of the population genetically would even very high amounts of salt be a concern. Like there's been studies done over the past 50 years giving even upwards of 100 grams of salt to people with normal blood pressure, not and it not causing a significant increase in blood pressure. The problem is most of us are metabolically sick. We're insulin resistant. We have elevated insulin levels that's causing us to over retain salt. So a lot of people will tell you, yes, if I consume salt, my blood pressure skyrockets. That's a sign of an unhealthy person. That should not happen. That's a sign of basically insulin resistance. If you fix the insulin resistance, then you're going to fix the salt sensitivity. So salt sensitivity is actually a good marker for insulin resistance. So typically, if you increase potassium and magnesium in the diet and you decrease refined carbs and sugars, you are going to fix someone's salt sensitivity. And then they can consume a normal amount of salt, which is what we should be able to do because we need salt for good blood volume, good blood circulation, nerve function, muscle contraction, etc. So we don't want to be limiting salt to this minuscule amount because, we're metabolically broken. We want to fix that, and then most people would be able to tolerate a normal amount of salt.
Why is salt, though, such like the evil culprit out there? Anytime
Because
I talk about salt, people are like, I can't have too much salt. you know?
Yeah, because it's a nuanced discussion. Most doctors don't really know the nuance to it, and they're going off of, like, what they learned 30 years ago or 40 years ago in medical school, and they're basically it just comes down to what I just said, that it's not you can't blame an essential mineral on a chronic health condition,
Mm.
unless your body's not able to handle it for some reason because it's metabolically broken. So there's always going to be, though, a bell-shaped curve for every nutrient. So for some reason, they never talk about this with salt. They always say you got to eat the lowest amount, but there's always going to be not enough, too much, and then an optimal amount. And we see that bell-shaped curve really being 4,000 milligrams for most people seems to be about optimal. Somewhere between 3,000 and maybe upwards of 5,000, especially for athletes. Actually, if you work out at least 1 hour a day, the balance studies show that you need almost 5,000 milligrams of sodium just to remain in positive balance. So that's also lost in translation. Like telling someone to go on a low salt diet, if they're an athlete, that's like, one of the worst things you can tell someone.
Um, okay, but I'm curious because potassium plays a role in this as well as getting to help the sodium get into the cell. And so, do you think some people are just too high in sodium and not enough potassium?
Yeah, that's an important thing too. If you don't, and that's why the three things that I mentioned, potassium, magnesium, and then decreasing refined carbs and sugars will fix the salt sensitivity because all three are important. Potassium in particular, if you're not getting at least about 3 grams, you're going to over retain salt. The salt that you eat, you're going to over retain it. So you do want to be getting at least 3 grams or more, ideally 3.7 to 4 grams of potassium per day. So yeah, they all have a role.
Do you think because the old school thought was, oh, people are getting too much salt in their diet just through all the processed foods and things like that. Do you think people are getting too much salt and not enough magnesium, potassium, and so it's not getting enough of the potassium, magnesium that's causing the too much salt? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, exactly. So if you think about it from like a historical perspective, prior to refrigeration, humans always used salt as the single most preservative for food. And their intake of salt was much higher than it was today. So the Romans consumed on average like 25 grams of salt. In the Scandinavian countries where they would have to basically have a lot of salted herring and cod, they would consume upwards of 60 to 100
Wow.
grams of salt per day.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but then we invented the refrigerator. We no longer needed salt as a preservative. So, yes, do processed foods contain salt? Yeah, they do. But most people still aren't consuming more than like 5,000 milligrams of sodium, even if they eat a processed food diet. And that wouldn't really be a problem if their potassium intake was at least 3.5 grams, I would say, and their magnesium intake was at least 400 milligrams, and they didn't have insulin resistance. Then it wouldn't be probably a problem.
What do you think about the different salts though? Like, is there a difference between sea salt versus Himalayan versus just table salt?
The main difference between like a pink rock salt and a sea salt is that the pink rock salt will have iodine, whereas the sea salt really won't. That's the main difference. Um, you can also talk about the fact that if you're getting your salt from an underground location, especially if it's an ancient ocean that was dried up, now you're not dealing with any type of modern day pollution as well. So if you're harvesting from an ocean from a modern day ocean, then you're going to have more microplastics and contamination. Not that I don't like to fear monger or anything like that, but I mean, that's just it is what it is.
And so some of those sea salts and Himalayan salts, things like that, can have other trace minerals where our processed table salt does not have the other trace minerals, correct?
Yeah. So table salt will just be pure sodium chloride. Whereas let's say your pink salt, rock salts are going to have fairly good amounts of iodine, but that's from a mineral perspective, that's probably the only one that you're getting in consequential amounts. Like everything else, yes, there is some magnesium, there is some calcium, but you're only going to be getting anywhere from like 10 to 20 milligrams. So it's not going to be a huge gain. You basically don't get your other minerals from, unrefined salts. You can get iodine from it, but besides that, you're taking salt basically just for the salt, the sodium and chloride.
Okay, I think magnesium should be taken every day, right, by majority of the people. But I also think that about electrolytes. Is that not correct thinking?
No, I think, well, so An electrolyte is a charged mineral. So basically, if you're taking an like you can take magnesium as a capsule, or it can be an electrolyte dissolved in water, right? Like it's a powder, you put it in water, now it's an electrolyte. So just you're kind of like however you want to take it. You want to take it as a powder, or you want to take it as, you know, an electrolyte like dissolved in water. You know, it's gonna turn into an electrolyte, right? When you consume it and you drink the capsule down with water. It's just that a lot of people like the flavoring of electrolytes, so it just makes it easier for people instead of having to pop pills constantly.
Okay, so but it's totally safe for someone to drink electrolytes every day.
Yeah, I think so. The only caveat I would say is you got to watch the kidney function. If you have bad kidney function, then potassium and magnesium can be a problem. But if you have normal kidney function, then potassium and magnesium are typically not going to be a problem.
All right, well, we're going to move on to another topic, another one that is confusing to my followers, and that is saturated fat and cholesterol. And so this might be a huge question to ask you. Can you debunk some myths about cholesterol and saturated fat?
So I think if you look back, it all stems from the 1977 dietary goals going against saturated fat and cholesterol. We didn't even have the Cochrane review formed until 1993, which is the gold standard team that does meta-analyses on randomized controlled trials to actually say, yes, this is true, yes, this isn't. So we had already demonized cholesterol and saturated fat in 1977, but we didn't even have the gold standard meta-analyses to actually see if that's true until 1993. So it was only based on expert opinion. And the dietary goals became the guidelines. So the 77 goals became the 1980 dietary guidelines, and they simply were updated every 5 years. So myself and Zoe Harcombe and several other authors published two meta-analyses on basically the clinical studies looking at is saturated fat harmful or not. We went back to when the dietary goals were created and no, there was not actual evidence to demonize them. And then we did an updated one on the current evidence. And we found that there was no evidence to actually demonize saturated fat from a clinical trial perspective. So most dietary guidelines are not based on level evidence A, which would be meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials in humans. They're based on level evidence C, which is expert opinion. Which most people wouldn't think that. Most people would think guidelines are 100% based on level evidence A. And for nutrition, that has not been the case for 50 years.
That is crazy to me. That
Yeah.
is just off of opinion.
hmm
So, how does saturated fat then affect heart health?
If you combine saturated fat with refined carbs, it's a problem. Um, Long chain saturated fats, let's say from like cream and butter and etc. When you combine that with refined carbs, yeah, that's a recipe for fat storage. But that's what gets lost in translation. Everyone thinks saturated fat's bad because everybody's consuming a high carb diet. So when you test it in a high carb population, you see that, oh wow, butter caused so much more fat gain than olive oil. But test it in a lower carb group, and you're not going to find that. So that therein lies the nuance. And also, it's really the carbs that increase saturated fats in the blood. So there's been studies by Volek and others looking at a high fat, low carb diet versus a high carb, low fat diet, low in saturated fat. And the low saturated fat diet with higher carb caused significantly more increases in saturated fats in the body versus the high saturated fat, low carb diet. So it's the carbs also that are actually driving this.
Interesting. So the butter cooking the let's say the steak is awesome, but the butter with the sugar and the flour and the brownies is where the issue lies.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay, so then obviously the saturated fat, that explanation is almost the same then for inflammation levels in the body.
Yeah. Saturated fat is stable when cooked, whereas polyunsaturated is unstable. And so cooking with butter is much better than cooking with like, let's say, sunflower oil. And that's where most of the inflammation in the body is really coming from. A lot of the inflammatory seed oils that we're cooking with, that's where a lot of it's coming from.
Okay, so Oh, I could go off on a whole tangent on inflammatory seed oils. Should we talk about them for a second?
Sure.
Okay. I I always teach, like, let's cook with a better choice oil, right? So I'm constantly talking about avocado oil, butter, tallow, extra virgin olive oil. But then you get the people that are saying, no, these seed oils are just fine. They're not harming the body. They're not causing inflammation. So why are they even saying that?
Uh, well, I would say number one, they're looking at the meta-analysis that shows that seed oils don't increase inflammation, but that's because they're looking at those meta-analyses took studies where they didn't cook the seed oils. So yeah, if you consume an organic cold pressed, let's say sunflower oil, that's totally different than cooking with it, right? And most people are cooking with it. Most people aren't just consuming like organic cold pressed seed oils. So, but if you look at the actual clinical studies in humans comparing, let's say, seed oils to trans fats and saturated fats combined, which there's been at least two meta-analyses that have done that. Seed oils show an increased risk in all-cause mortality, cardiovascular death, even compared to the combination of saturated fat and trans fat. Um, and so the clinical studies to me are pretty clear that if you cook with a seed oil, it's going to increase mortality, likely increase cancer as well. Dayton and colleagues showed that too in an 8-year study that uh, the seed oils increased cancer. I think it would just miss statistical significance. I think it was like 0.06, but it was significantly more people got cancer from the seed oils than not.
So interesting. I heard a study the other day that the seed oils were making the fat cells larger than what they should be.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting data on that because it drives inflammation and basically inflammation drives everything in the wrong way. So I could see there's some interesting animal studies looking at all that. I think the biggest issue is we do store this. Our linoleic acid content in our fat cells has dramatically gone up by like 3 or 4 fold over the last 50 years. It now makes up 20% of our total calories when it never did at all. It never existed. And so from that perspective, I think you're consuming something that we never consumed before. It's saturating all your cells and your fat cells, and it's highly oxidizable because it's polyunsaturated. And it's the double bonds, the polyunsaturated means multiple, basically double bonds. Those are susceptible to free radical attacks. So you don't want a highly susceptible fatty acid in your cell membranes, in your fat cells, in your body that can oxidize very easily.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we did a little side tangent there. Back to saturated fats. What is the role of saturated fats with cholesterol? A negative impact, positive impact, both?
I think I care more about oxidized cholesterol, and actually saturated fat has been shown to decrease how much the cholesterol that you cook oxidizes because it's a stable fat. So, ironically enough, the cholesterol we should be worried about, oxidized cholesterol, is protected by saturated fat. So that to me, that's a more interesting story than uh, don't consume cholesterol or don't consume saturated fat because it might raise your bad cholesterol. Typically, dietary cholesterol isn't going to raise your cholesterol. If it does, it's raising the good cholesterol, HDL. Saturated fat may raise quote unquote bad LDL, but it's making them more large and more buoyant. And refined carbs and sugars increases insulin resistance and makes those LDLs smaller, more dense, more susceptible to oxidation. So, again, the nuance is actually showing saturated fats to be more beneficial, and it's more the refined carbs and sugars that are the issue.
So interesting because you still don't hear that out there. They still, if your cholesterol is too high, they say reduce the saturated fats, not reduce the sugar and the highly processed carbs.
Yeah, that drives me crazy. Just look at the carotid arteries. You can do an ultrasound for $100 on the carotid arteries and actually visualize and see if someone has atherosclerosis or not. And even if they have an elevated LDL, let's say, if they don't have any plaque, then you know who's more at risk. You could have someone with great cholesterol and they have a ton of plaque, or you can have someone with high cholesterol and no plaque. So if we're not actually visualizing the disease itself, then I think you're giving someone like limited information and you're potentially scaring them when they're potentially healthy, or you're potentially telling someone that they're totally fine because their cholesterol is good when they actually have a ton of plaque. So just visualize it and you can tell, you can basically see if you're more at risk or not.
We could do a whole show on just cholesterol because then you've got the issue of so many people on cholesterol lowering drugs, and do they even need to be on those? Or you know what I mean?
Yeah, so the statins, they seem to work not through necessarily cholesterol lowering, but their anti-inflammatory effects. So there's been studies where they tested people where they just had high inflammation, like high C-reactive protein, and gave them a statin, and they didn't really have that elevated of LDL, and there were significant benefits. So for secondary prevention, a statin has some decent benefits, but it doesn't seem to really extend lifespan. You may have less heart attacks. Potentially, you may have less fatal heart attacks, but there's the side effects of muscle cramps, muscle pain, cognitive decline. You have to offset those.
So if cholesterol is related to inflammation or can be related with inflammation, so many people are dealing with inflammation. So really it should be that we tackle the inflammation first.
Yeah, interestingly enough, inflammation decreases cholesterol. So people with really low cholesterol levels um, could actually be due to high inflammation, which is kind of interesting. And so you could have great cholesterol, but it could be due to high inflammation.
Oh, that's interesting.
Hmm.
Well, low cholesterol, really low cholesterol isn't great though either.
It's not. And the reason why we kind of know that basically inflammation drops cholesterols after heart attack, it's a massive inflammatory response, and that will drop cholesterol a lot. Um, and so I think again, cholesterol is just a bad surrogate marker by itself to kind of try to say, hey, you're at risk of cardiovascular disease or you're not.
Yeah. Okay, well, I want to talk about something that deals with cholesterol. Well, in our society for years and years, we were told like don't eat eggs because eggs are full of cholesterol. Eggs will raise your cholesterol, right? And so eggs though to me are very nutritious. So I think you would agree that we should include eggs in our diet.
Yeah, definitely. I eat about 3 to 6 eggs a day. I try to eat half of my eggs as kind of like over easy because if you do overcook the yolk, you are decreasing some of the vitamins and minerals. You're kind of damaging them. You're damaging some of the omega 6 and omega 3s. So ideally, if you cannot overcook, like if you're going to scramble your eggs, kind of like lightly scramble them. Um, I mean, of course, I have normal scrambled eggs, like, I'm not like afraid of them. But from an optimal health perspective, I try not to overcook the yolks all the time.
Okay, good to know.
Mhm.
Eggs, though, can support the absorption of fat soluble vitamins too, right? And I feel like so many people aren't just deficient in minerals, they're deficient in a lot of vitamins as well. So that's another plus, wouldn't it be?
Yes. Yep.
All right, you have answered so many questions that I get from all of my listeners. And so, health can be really overwhelming to people, especially people that are just trying to, figure out how to eat nourishing foods and clean up their diets. And so, do you have any advice for those that are just starting out on this journey of trying to improve their health?
Yeah, I mean, I think simple things, eating out less, trying to avoid fast food, trying to cook at home, using single ingredients, and walking every day, trying to lift some weights 2, 3, 4 times a week. Those are some of the most simple things that can really have a dramatic impact on someone's health.
And if somebody is just starting out and wants to improve their diet and they're working on that and want to buy, let's say, 3 supplements, are there 3 supplements that are your favorite just for the general overbeing of Americans?
Yeah, I would say like D3 and K2 and magnesium, or just a good multivitamin slash mineral. But typically, the multivitamin slash mineral has to be combined and added magnesium, D3, K2, because usually the multivitamin mineral they're too low for optimal intakes for those three other nutrients.
Okay, good
Yep.
to know. Well, thank you so much for being here on the show today. Listeners, like I said, his Instagram is so amazing. I love that it's nice and simple and easy to digest and understand. And you're a wealth of knowledge. So tell my listeners where they can find you.
Yeah, my Instagram handle is at Dr. James Dinick, and my website is drjamesdinick.com.
Well, and tell them where they can find your books because your books are fascinating.
My books are on Amazon, and some of them, like my first 3 books, like the Sulfix and Super Fuel and Longevity Solution, that would be like Amazon. You can get them too, or really any bookstore.
I'm curious, are you working on an 11th book?
I am working on a supplement book and a cookbook. My cookbook's coming out at the end of March.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah.
A cookbook full of minerals?
Yeah. Well, it is called Salt to Taste. So there is 1 mineral in there. Well, 2, sodium chloride. That will be, definitely a good seasoning for the meals. So
Oh, that's exciting. I'll have to pay attention to when that comes out.
yeah.
Well, I always end my podcast by asking my guests what they have found to be the best ingredient in life. What would you say it is? I should say besides salt. You're not allowed to answer with salt.
Oh, my best ingredient would be my wife. Who you marry is definitely, helps determine your happiness. And if you have a good partner, I think that really helps. So
I love that. A lot of people lately are answering with like connections or relationships. So I love that. I love that you're on the same track as all these other guests. So you guys must all just be, really great people.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I know you answered a ton of questions that I get a lot. So this will be really easy for me to just give this podcast as a reference to people when they're asking these questions about creatine and collagen and things like that. So thank you for taking the time to be here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Remember to subscribe to the Just Ingredients podcast to learn more about your health and good ingredients to life. Plus, get daily tips at just.ingredients on Instagram.